Up next, we're gonna have a conversation about chronicling war and occupation, starting at 10. And I hope to see you all there. Thank you.
Hello, Jeff.
Hey, how are you? Good. How are you guys doing? How's the first panel? Watch out! That guy behind you is very dangerous. He's really serious. I'm everywhere. God says, Moises, bow down. I didn't. I had no idea that you were even going to be there. What are you doing in Boston? Oh, that's right. I forgot. Damn. Look, Moises, next time you come through New York, man, let me know. And if I'm in Boston, I'll obviously let you know. Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, check 1, 2. Hey, check 1, 2.
Welcome, everyone. Bye. Is Ron sitting at the end, or is he just? No, he's on Zoom. Oh, okay.
Recording in progress.
Just noting I can't share my screen or anything.
Welcome, everyone. We're excited to have you at our third panel of this symposium on chronicling war and occupation. My name is Gauri Kashyap. I'm a junior here at Tufts University and the co-president of the South Asian Regional Committee. Journalism in conflict or post-conflict zones puts journalists in an incredibly vulnerable position where they're risking their safety and often their lives. War reporting is vital. It exposes us to the real costs of a war, the destruction of homes, families, and lives. It allows those of us that are not experiencing the atrocities that war causes to be cognizant of its dangers. In recent years, as global wars and terrorism continues to be on the rise, accurately covering conflict requires more resources, time, and energy. Moreover, with the attack on the free press in many war-torn and occupied countries, the dangers and complications that war journalists face have only exacerbated. Before the panel discussion, we have a presentation by Ron Haviv, my apologies, an Emmy-nominated and award-winning photojournalist, filmmaker, and co-founder of the photo agency Seven and the Seven Foundation, dedicated to documenting conflict and raising human rights issues around the globe. His work in the Balkans was used as evidence to indict and convict war criminals at the International Tribunal in The Hague. His photography is in museum collections all over the world. Blood and Honey, a Balkan war journal, was called one of the best nonfiction books of the year by the LA Times. His other monographs are Afghanistan, The Road to Kabul, Haiti, 12th January 2010, The Lost Roles and Shadow of Memory. We are delighted he could join us today.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here on this IGL event on something that continues to be incredibly important. I'm just going to talk very briefly before handing it over to Moises and others to talk about their work. And one of the things that's incredibly interesting is that when you realize that last year, there were over 1 trillion photographs taken, 1 trillion images, which is like pretty incredible. All of you probably have contributed to that number because today pretty much all of us are photographers, and we contributed with photographs of your friends, your family life, your experiences, your lunches, your dinners, and pictures of your cats. And they represent important moments for you in your life. But at the same time, a smaller group of photographers, photojournalists, and especially in the niche section of war, have also been contributing to that number, trying to take photographs to have impact, for photographs to help to communicate. And one of our goals as photographers is that it's really incredibly important for us to have impact with our work. And as it says here, you can look at a picture for a week and never think of it again. You can look at a picture for a second and remember it all your life. And also that second, which is often kind of the interaction that many of us have with work via Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, Facebook, etc. But if there can be impact from that photograph, then I think for myself, certainly as a photographer, then the photograph is a success. So in the last 30 years, I've worked as a photographer in over 100 countries, and I've documented over 25 conflicts. And I've dedicated my focus to the purpose of raising awareness about issues that affect human rights. A number of months this year, I've been in Ukraine documenting the Ukraine-Russia war. And I think imagery is ever more important, especially as we're all tied together. When I'm asked to explain what I do, often when I say I'm the one heading into a place where everybody else is leaving, when there's this idea that there's danger, that you're risking your life and so on, it's very hard for people to actually understand, like, why would somebody do that? Why do men and women do that? What possibly could motivate you to do that? And why would you think that your photographs would rise above all the other images of the lunches and cats and so on? And it's a really good question. And I think that is, for me, it took a while to really understand why I do what I do and what kind of impact I think that I can have with the work. And over the course of the last couple of years, I've been working on a documentary film with the co-director, Dr. Lauren Walsh, called Biography of a Photo. And we look at two photographs that I took more than 30 years ago and essentially are looking at the history and biography of that image and the impact that those images have and have until this day, more than 30 years later. And through that exploration of the impact of those photographs, some of these questions, why do I do what I do, are easily answered. So I'm going to bring you back to 1989, different time period, a long time ago, just when I was starting out as a photographer, and I was interested in covering foreign stories. And there was a story happening in the Central American country of Panama, and the story was basically very simple. Panama was being run by a dictator named General Manuel Noriega. Panama was an incredibly important country for the world because of the Panama Canal. And it was also incredibly important, aside from that, for the United States, because they had their main military base for all their Latin American activities being based in Panama. But the dictator was starting to go off the rails. He was not sort of basically being connected to what the Americans wanted. And Noriega, the dictator, decided to hold elections to tell the world that he wasn't a dictator, but was actually loved by his people. And I couldn't really afford to go to Panama, but a friend of mine, Chris Morris, gave me an extra plane ticket, and off I went to Panama to document this election. The election was held. The dictator lost the election. He then nullified the results. And the would-be victors came out onto the streets to basically start an uprising, to start a civil war, to try to overthrow the dictator. And this was kind of started to experience my first bit of violence, protests in the streets, tear gas, soldiers beating up protesters, and so on. And it was all very interesting. I was working for Agence France Presse. My photographs were being seen around the world, and so on. And on the main day of the protest, I was following the vice president-elect and the president-elect as they were traveling, trying to raise support for the protesters to keep up their fight, when they became surrounded by a paramilitary group known as the Dignity Battalion, supporters of the dictator, who then began to beat everybody up It was almost like a scene out of a movie, coming in with like T-shirts with their name on it, holding sticks and pipes and beating up everybody and shooting and so on. It was complete chaos. At one point, I saw a man with a gun walk up to a four-wheel drive and basically take out his pistol and fire directly into the car. And a few moments later, the door of the car kind of opens, and this man stumbles out, and he's covered in blood. And as he sort of stumbles around, I hear somebody say to me, "Compromiso" in Spanish, which means "excuse me." And one of the paramilitary guys sort of steps around me and proceeds to beat up the vice president-elect. Here you see the vice president-elect on the left side, covered in blood, being beaten up by a paramilitary. As you can see, if you look at this picture closely in the background, there's a soldier standing there doing absolutely nothing. I went to AFP. We sent the images around the world. They were on the front pages of newspapers around the world the next day. And by the end of the week, I had the cover of all three American magazines, as well as many other magazines around the world. And this was kind of like the first time this had been done, supposedly since the war of Vietnam, that one photographer had the cover of all three news weeklies. And so this was my first foreign trip, and everybody thought of me as sort of a photo hero. And I was like, well, this photography thing is not so bad. It's pretty easy, actually. You go places, you take pictures, you get covers. Everybody thinks you're amazing and so on. And I was like, me, 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 me. This is all about my life and what I'm going to do. And I was super excited. 7 months later, after a lot of diplomacy and so on, where this photograph, especially this cover of Time magazine, was used by the U.S. Secretary of State and others to basically get the world against the dictator, the United States invaded Panama in December of 1989. And as the troops were flying towards Panama, the President of the United States gave this talk to the American people.
You remember those horrible pictures of newly elected Vice President Ford, covered head to toe with blood, beaten mercilessly by so-called dignity battalions.
When I heard that speech, and even though I was with the troops going in for the invasion at the time, kind of a light bulb went over my head, and all of a sudden I kind of really understood a little bit more about the purpose of journalism, the purpose of what I was doing, photojournalism, what my colleagues were doing. And it's not about us. It's not about covers. It's not about prizes. It's not about money. And certainly, without question, not about money. This is not a career to do well in. But it really was about something bigger. And understanding that my photographs were playing a role in the conversation about what was going on in the world was kind of breathtaking and humbling. And it wasn't that whether or not I agreed with the invasion or not. It was kind of putting that aside. It was that understanding about the role of what photojournalism could do. This is probably, I think, one of the only, if not the only time when a president used a photograph as a justification for a military action. Now, without question, the justifications, the invasion did not happen because of the photograph. It was what the photograph represented. And of course, it was politically expedient for the president to use the image to speak about what was going on. But it still was part of that process. And so that was, really, really interesting for me to try to understand exactly what I was doing, as a photographer. Now, kind of jumping ahead to 1992, I had been continuing working as a photographer, covering different stories and so on. But in 1991, I read in the New York Times about this place called Yugoslavia, which was a country in Eastern Europe that had straddled the world between the former Soviet Union and the West. And people thought that Yugoslavia would make this really amazing transition to the New World Order. And it didn't start off well. In 1991, there were two wars. The first one lasting a number of days, the second one lasting months. And then by 1992, people were talking about what was going to happen in this place called Bosnia, that if the West didn't intervene either militarily or diplomatically, a war was going to take place. And I had already spent a lot of time there. I had met this guy who's holding up the tiger, Serbian paramilitary, a warlord known as Arkan. His unit is known as, I guess you can probably guess, the Tigers. That's his mascot. And they were known for incredible brutality, human rights abuses, and war crimes in the war in Croatia. I managed to embed myself as I arrived in a small town called Bijeljina, which was on the Bosnian border with Serbia. And they arrived in the town to basically cleanse the town of quote unquote Muslim fundamentalists. And this essentially became the first battle of the war in Bosnia. And so I was able to document them as they moved through town, as they took down the Islamic flag and posed for it as a victory, and so on. But things started to get much worse. And as they reached the sort of city center across the street from the mosque where they were posing for pictures with the flag, there were a number of civilians who were hiding in the house across the street. And I heard some shouting. A couple was brought out of a house. The woman, Hamieta Pajeti, was yelling at the soldiers. The soldiers were simultaneously yelling at her and yelling at me, saying, "No photographs, no photographs." Some shots rang out. Her husband, Abdurraham, who you see here now in this photograph, lay on the ground bleeding as she tried to staunch the bleeding. Continued shouting, continued so on. I realized that there was nothing that I could do at this point to stop the execution. The soldiers knew I was there with the camera. They didn't care. But I realized that I needed to be able to try to document what was going on, so I was able to take this photograph. Moments later, she was shot as well. A few moments later, they brought out another woman, Aisha Shabanovic. They then shot her. They then went to kind of take a break, and they had taken a prisoner who was Aisha Shabanovic's son, Admir. He tried to escape. They then shot and killed him. I wasn't able to photograph that or stop that. And then they decided to leave. And as they left, they took another prisoner, the man you see here, Harush Zabiri, and they took him off to the headquarters. But I realized that I didn't have the actual irrefutable proof to accuse them of the war crimes that they were committing. So I needed a photograph of the Serbian paramilitaries with their victims in the same frame, so nobody could deny that they were there. And as I sort of framed the image of the three victims, Serbian paramilitaries came from my left, and I was able to capture this image. So note the details on this photograph. You see here, Serbian paramilitary soldier, later identified as by other people as Srđan Golubovic, who's also a part-time DJ in Belgrade, casually approaching the victims with a cigarette in one hand, sunglasses on his head, and so on. These photographs were published around the world in Time and Stern and other places. And at the time, the world conversation was, what do we do about Bosnia? And the war hadn't officially started. These photographs were taken on March 31st. The war officially began on April 6th. So I thought that the publication of these images would be enough to push the world into some sort of action, that this was going to be a really bad war of well-armed people executing unarmed civilians, and the world still had an opportunity to do something. And they didn't. And the war started officially, lasted for almost 4 years. Thousands were killed, millions more became refugees, then led to another war in Kosovo with hundreds of thousands more refugees, thousands more killed. And today, Bosnia itself is a dysfunctional state. So as Lauren and I started working on this film, we started to kind of talk about like what were the different things that kind of happened. So the idea that I learned in Panama kind of morphed into a new one. Now, while I again never believed that the pictures in Panama were the reason for the invasion, when the pictures were completely ignored in Bosnia and didn't affect sort of any sort of public policy, even though it was shown to the public, I felt like the photographs had failed. And as the war in Bosnia continued and more journalists were being killed and wounded and less people were paying attention, the question was, what happens to our work when people ignore it or it falls apart or it disappears? And that becomes a very serious question to ask, especially again with all of these images out there. How does the work live? And so what I started to realize, especially by doing this film, is that the work started to have a life of its own, both the work from Panama and the work from Bosnia. And so when we're doing this film, we see that the biographies that we're doing of each image weave this narrative to show how the photos have actually shaped history, memory, and the cultural fabric of entire populations. So when we look at the photograph from Panama, shortly after the image was published, it was declared illegal to have the image. It was declared illegal to have Time magazine. People were faxing, if you guys remember faxes, faxing the photo around to say, hey, look, the world is paying attention to what's happening. It gave the opposition hope in their fight against the dictatorship. And using one quote from somebody that we met, one of the opposition leaders, he said, my friends died. They died for democracy. The photo changed everything. It renewed our courage to stand up and fight. Vice President Ford, the guy covered in blood, became untouchable because he became such a well-known figure because of the photograph. And he said that the photograph actually saved his life. When we look at the photograph from Bosnia, it was immediately made into a recruiting poster seen around the Islamic world as a come help your brothers, look what's happening to us. Very much from the beginning, artists started to change the photograph and use it for their artistic purposes. Melduvan Ekmatic did a series of images from the war, starting out with this photo, his interpretation of my photograph. It was used in graphic novels and so on. Jean-Luc Godard, the French filmmaker who just died, used the photograph and made a 3-minute film about his protest for the Bosnian War, using the photograph as a way to meditate about the man's inhumanity to man. When eventually the International War Crimes Tribunal for The Hague opened up, the photograph was said to be the inspiration for the creation of The Hague.
These are civilians, I always assumed, and they are being killed, executed in the most brutal manner by a beast, not by a human being, by a beast. So you can imagine what that means and why the tribunal has used it.
You're aware that these photos were published and distributed essentially worldwide and roughly at the time and since. Well, you know, it doesn't take much to go to a website called Iconic Photographs, which means photographs that are particularly famous.
So not only was it used as inspiration for the creation of the War Crimes Tribunal, but it was used to indict and convict people of war crimes that were connected to the chain of command for the war crimes that took place that day. On the anniversary of the U.S. invasion, which is marked every year in Panama, which many Panamanians consider a war crime, 30 years later, I was confronted by a man who recognized me as the photographer for the photograph that many Panamanians think was responsible for the invasion.
Tu foto hizo que mataran gente en mi país. Tu foto. Tú dijiste, igual lo hiciste en Sarajevo, igual lo hiciste en Somalia. Tú dijiste que esta foto que salió en Times.
So another testament to the power of the photograph 30 years later, it is still engaging, it's still being published continuously in Panama for what it represents. And so as I'm just sort of closing here, it's kind of important to say, like, you know, these are just a few of the ways in both photos played a role in the way in shaping the histories of the places that they were taken. And as we worked on biography of photo, we also discovered that for each image, there was somebody who was personally and gravely affected by the events of the day. So we had the big kind of impact, foreign policy, what it represents, war crimes, violence, etc. But there were also people that are personally connected to the story. So we found this man named Manuel, whose brother Alexis Guerra was the bodyguard who was killed lying on top of Guillermo Ford. Much of the blood on Guillermo Ford's shirt is from his bodyguard. But Manuel feels that his brother's sacrifice and death for democracy has been denied and ignored.
Todos los días paso por donde lo que ocurrió ese día y usted sabe, es un sentimiento que no se puede explicar, que lo llevo dentro de mí, que no se ha podido concretar todas las cosas que se han dicho, que hicieron, y hasta la fecha estoy esperando esa justicia que no se ha dado todavía. Yo quiero que esas fotos que se vivió ese día queden en la historia, y en el monumento, en vez de poner una placa, el último que murió fue Manuel Alexis Guerra Morales, que pasó ese 10 de mayo.
And then on the Bosnian side, we have Alma, Alma Pekovich, who's the daughter of Aisha Shabanovich, who's one of the women that was late dying in that photograph. And she is trying to get justice for her mother's death.
U želji da završim sve ovo, da pravda istjera na vidjelo, da ljudi koji su odgovorni za ovo odgovaraju. Ništa se ne dešava, ništa se nije pomaklo s mjesta. Oni šetaju slobodno, žive, rade, uživaju. Mojih roditelja, mojih brata, mojih komšija, prijatelja nema više.
So both Manuel and Alma are on this personal journey for justice, a quest for truth, a quest for reparation. And as the two images become more and more famous and have impact, these little people, the working class bodyguard and the civilian bystander, get overlooked by society. So we explore the story of their search for justice before it's too late and before they're forgotten by history. And so that is, again, kind of like the things that the power of the photography that we do that can reach all of these different levels. So Alma's war crimes prosecution remains open in Serbia. Manuel's attempt to get recognition for his brother continues to remain open, both of them using the respective photographs as kind of the main thrust to be able to kind of tell this story. So the photographs we're surrounded by, they have the opportunity to inform and influence, sometimes under the guidance of the media, and sometimes they can live on their own, traveling throughout the world and hopefully having an impact wherever they are seen. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your panel.
Thank you, Mr. Haviv. That was so powerful, and these photographs really show the dangers that journalists in war zones face on a daily basis. We will explore the nuances of reporting in conflict during our panel today. Each panelist will give 5-minute opening remarks, after which we will get into the panel discussion. That will be followed by an audience Q&A. Here to talk about this issue today are Mike Eckel, Moises Saman, and Lauren Wolf. Please welcome them. Our first presenter will be Lauren Wolf. Miss Wolf is an award-winning journalist and photographer who has written for publications from The Atlantic to The Guardian. She's conducted field reporting from the Middle East to Central Africa to Central America, interviewing hundreds of women and men suffering from the fallout of war. She was named a finalist for the Anthony Shadid Award for Journalism Ethics and the Kurt Schock Memorial Award and the One World Media Awards, and was called one of 5 journalists making a big difference in the world by Bono's One.org. Ms. Wolf?
Thank you. Am I supposed to use this? Yeah. Is this on? Yeah, that's on. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. I didn't necessarily know what stories I wanted to tell because I think for all of us, like, we just live stories, there's so many, and that's what we do for a living. So it's also just, for me, who I am. I couldn't do anything else, basically. So I thought that I would jump off of what Ron said. He's really affecting change, with his photos. And I have had success at doing that in one case. And I'm now involved in a different situation that will also be moving justice forward. So I was in Ukraine over the summer, and I have a piece coming out in The Guardian, actually a long-form piece on Tuesday from that trip. And I was looking at the investigations of war crimes, so I was following around, like looking at war crimes myself, but also just trying to piece together how people are working and what they're doing in a country with, as of like 2 weeks ago, 33,000 registered war crimes with the prosecutor's office, While I was there, someone handed me a plastic shopping bag with pages and pages of Russian documents and like a book, like an actual hardcover, slim little book. It was like an attendance book with soldiers' names, addresses, parents' names, like when they signed up, when they didn't, it was remarkable. I had code names for people that matched with other things that showed what vehicle those people would be in. Call signals, like the first one was like laser 42 and it meant run, that kind of thing. It's a remarkable cache. And actually one of the things that's interesting about it is an evacuation map from Ukraine to Belarus. And it actually shows that the Russians thought they were going to get very far south and sort of west in Ukraine. They came nowhere near it because that's where their starting point was. So everything is sort of badly planned and all that. But the point of this is that those documents, I worked very hard to make sure that they were preserved by the person who found them, not passed around. You've got to kind of keep the provenance, like the chain of custody can't be broken or they can't be used in criminal trials. Or they may be used, but like it's much stronger if you can, verify that they are authentic, that they have stayed in one place, that kind of thing. But then I spent weeks once I got home literally coordinating, just, can you bring it here? He's bringing this, she's doing that. But finally it all turned over to the International Criminal Court. So it's going to be interesting to watch how they use that, and I'm looking forward to it. Do I have time for one more story? Okay, we need to move on, so I'll tell you my little story later.
Thank you for those remarks. Our next speaker is Mike Eckel, a past EPIC speaker and Fletcher alumnus. Mike Eckel is a senior correspondent for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, based in Prague, Czech Republic, reporting on political and economic developments in Russia, Ukraine, and around the former Soviet Union, as well as news involving cybercrime and espionage. He has reported on the ground on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the wars in Chechnya and Georgia, and the 2004 Beslan hostage crisis, as well as the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Mr. Eckel.
Thanks for having me. Glad I could be here today. And I don't have any formal prepared remarks. I'll say, just in brief, my career has been covering Russia, Ukraine, the former Soviet Union, pretty much since 1998. I was based in Moscow for 6.5 years, and over that period of time, it's been both fascinating and very depressing to see the trajectory that Russian society, that the Kremlin has pulled Russian society in. These days in Prague, I spend, half of my time is doing Ukrainian war reporting, and the half the time is just charting this reversion to this Soviet authoritarian police state that's going on within Russia. It's very personal for me. I went there as an undergraduate student right after the Berlin Wall fell, and it was this heady time of Russians discovering the world and embracing the West and all things American, and so to be witness to this reversion to a police state it's professionally it's fascinating. Personally, it's very depressing. Sad to see happening. I guess I'll offer up what might be a little bit of a naive comment there, as being a reporter for more than 2 decades. That I believe in this notion that I'm a storyteller. That my job is to go out and listen to people, talk to people, find out what makes them tick. Why do they see the universe the way they do? Why do they believe the things they do? Why do they hate white people? Why do they hate black people? Why do they think the earth is flat? And then to tell that in such a way that, to bear witness to their stories, and to tell that in such a way that conveys their lives to a wider audience, to the widest possible audience. And that doesn't always happen. Reporting is a messy profession. As Ron said, it's not a profession that you're going to get rich doing. It's a profession of incredible stress and frustration and grief and editors yelling at you and the hate mail. Deadlines, the hate mail that come in, death threats there, it all comes with the territory. But, whether you're a photographer or documentarian filmmaker or a radio reporter or a text reporter like myself, I really believe in this notion that you're out there telling people's stories and trying to do that as best as you can and to convey their stories to the widest possible audience around the world. And I feel very humble. It's a humbling experience, and I feel very blessed to be able to go and that my editors, my employers have trusted me with this great weight to go out and do this. There's a very famous quote about the profession of journalism, that it's the life of kings. H.L. Mencken once said, and I really believe that it is. It's an incredible experience to be running around the trenches of Ukraine, or after the Russians withdrew from Georgia in 2008, or to be talking to mothers of children killed in a terrorist attack at a school in southern Russia in 2004. It's an amazing profession, and I feel very blessed to be able to do that and to continue to do that. I'll stop there, and maybe more will come out in the question and answer.
Thank you, Mr. Echo. Our last panelist is Moises Saman, who is a Spanish-American photojournalist currently based in Jordan. From 2000 to 2007, he was a staff photographer at Newsday in New York, where he covered local news and features and the global fallout of the 9/11 attacks, including the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. In 2010, he joined Magnum Photos, and since that time, he has lived in Egypt, Lebanon, Spain, and Japan, with the Middle East as the primary focus of his work. In 2015, Saman was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in Photography for his work in covering the Arab Spring, culminating in the 2016 publication of his first monograph titled Discordia. Mr. Saman?
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm usually based in Jordan, but this year I'm doing a fellowship at Harvard, Newman Fellow, so it's very convenient. Just one subway stop away. I think following up on Franz, who's a friend and a colleague from many years, and somebody that really has sort of been an inspiration for me as we sort of started working around the same time. Just wanted to highlight the importance of the power that we as storytellers, as image makers have in shaping memory for the future, and this is something that I think maybe deserves a little bit more attention. Sometimes we get caught up in our work being published like immediately on measuring that success in terms of how often we get published or where do we get published. But I think really as Ron's current project is looking at the effects of work that we created years from now, and I think that part of my studies at Harvard this year is really looking at history and sort of the nexus of history and photography, and it really comes down to sort of having a shared memory that we all agree on, and in many places, including in this country, this is something that we don't have. This agreement that is so basic that everything sort of that follows from this disagreement, seeps into every aspect of society, into politics, and etc. So I just wanted to highlight this idea of thinking forward to the future and of the power that photography has in promoting a shared experience, a shared history that hopefully can unify people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. I want to now hand it over to my colleague Arjun for the moderated section of this panel.
Good morning to everybody here. Thank you, Gary, for introducing our speakers. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Arjun Bagar. I'm a junior at Tufts studying international relations. I'm also co-president with Gauri of the South Asian Regional Committee at the Institute for Global Leadership at Tisch College here at Tufts. Without further ado, I think we'll jump into the moderated section of the panel and get started with the questions. So much of what we saw with the initial coverage of the war in Ukraine put on display the discrepancies in the Western world's treatment of white Ukrainian refugees versus, for example, refugees from Syria. What is the role of Western media in normalizing tragedy in parts of the world such as the Middle East, Africa, South Asia, and Latin America?
Is that better? Yeah, thank you. Okay. So yeah, as someone who works in countries that they don't get a ton of coverage. And just for an example, just before the example, I also want to say that I cover war a little differently than most war journalists, not all, but I tend to go to refugee areas and I tend to report on very sensitive sort of trauma issues. You know, I'm not looking to get myself killed. Missiles landed in Kyiv when I was there, but I'm usually in places where like the threat is like a warlord, and maybe that's bad because I'm doing a story, but it's not bombs falling from the sky. So the example I wanted to give, I was in Guatemala many years ago, and I submitted a story to The Atlantic. They ran it. I had a second story that I wanted to pitch, and it was about the legacy of rape from the 30-year Civil War. My editor at The Atlantic, God bless him, said, "I'm sorry, we can't do this. We have another story running next month on women in Honduras." So, yeah, I mean, it's a limited space, and I know that it's a balance between editors deciding what needs to be told versus what sells, what readers want, right? Who's going to buy that paper? I've struggled with it for years. I did 7 years of reporting on one single story in Congo that actually, the story itself led to the arrest of 78 men who were gang raping 50 little girls in one village over 4 years. It was on like the front cover of the long form section of The Guardian. And nobody knew it, nobody saw it. I'd already written about it multiple times for Foreign Policy, for like wherever. Nobody knew about it. Then I suddenly become infamous in the last year, and everyone's like, "Holy shit, why didn't I hear about this?" I'm like, I don't know, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. Like, that actually was published. People may not care. I don't know. But the other thing is, if 1 3-year-old were raped in Brooklyn, there would be national news. I tried pitching around a book or a movie or a documentary. I tried like everything because I think the story is really important of how justice was actually how we came to justice. Excuse me. I was told over and over that the matter was too dark, and all I can think is like too Black African, because if these were white kids in Boston, of course this would be a book or documentary or something. So I really struggle with what readers and editors want versus what I think is important, and I don't know.
So, off the top of my head, it was a kind of a funny question to grapple with, and normalizing, what was it? The role of Western media in normalizing tragedy. And I was struggling to get my head around it. So my employer, Radio Free Europe, we publish in 26 different languages, from Russian to Ukrainian to Kazakh to Serbian and English as well. And as a reporter, I consume news in a different way than just people who go out and buy the New York Times at the newsstand or at their Starbucks there. Like, I start up my computer and I have 24 Russian newspapers, 12 Ukrainian websites. I have 200 Telegram channels running through my phone constantly. Twitter, WhatsApp chat groups there. It's just literally a fire hose of information that I'm trying to keep up with on an hourly basis. So I'm consuming news, that's not the Western media. I mean, yeah, I'm consuming what the Ukrainians are reading, what the Russians are reading, what the Kazakhs are reading there. So I have a slightly different, that's why I was struggling to come up with a coherent way to answer this question. I mean, I'm guessing that most people here speak multiple languages. If you don't, go learn another language there, because it's such an essential part of being a human being. And don't just consume your news from one source. Don't read the New York Times and think, well, that's all, nothing else I need to read. Go find the BBC or Ukrainska Pravda or Kommersant or the Telegram channels being run by the Insider or iStories, because you need to get the information as broadly as possible. And then the other thought was, normalizing tragedy. I was thinking about that in the context of being, as I was saying in my opening remarks, about being a storyteller and documenting, bearing witness to people's stories. And in 2004, September 2004, there was this incredible terrorist attack on a school in southern Russia, in Beslan, Russia. The first day of classes at this elementary school. And the school was having its opening day ceremonies, and this group of terrorists from nearby Chechnya and Ingushetia seized the school, and they took 1,200 people hostage, put them in the gymnasium for 3 days. Long story short, it ended when the Russian special forces stormed the school and tried to rescue these hostages, and in the end, 330 people died. I don't know the exact number right now, but more than half of them were children. And I was there for the very first hours after the school was seized, and was there for 11 days in total. It was such a powerful experience to be there and to be talking to mothers and fathers, and you're there like, so tell me, how does it feel that your son was killed at this terrorist attack? And, it was, every day I would come home sort of sobbing and trying to figure out, all right, how am I going to write this story? How am I going to tell these people's stories honestly, accurately, and hopefully with some impact for the world? So is that normalizing tragedy? No, it's trying to find a human connection with someone and relay that connection to tell them to the world. Long story short, it's a funny question.
Well, I think it's a good question, and it's something that really we have to own as members of the press, and I think that there's absolutely a disparity in the way, at least in the context of this war in Ukraine, which is an incredibly important historical moment that absolutely deserves our attention. But I do think that there's a disparity in the way that the mainstream media, the Western-based media, has been covering this war in vis-a-vis other conflicts in Yemen. Is it on? Or off? Sorry. Can you hear me anyways? Yeah. And I think that there's this disparity. We are part of it. I am part of it as somebody that has been publishing work in mainstream publications. And this is something that, to be honest, it's part of the reason why I'm here this year, to sort of try to understand really what my role is personally in my practice as a photographer, and how to be more conscious, excuse me, how can I make a difference, with my own little, sort of power as as a photographer. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair question, and I think that what it's interesting to me is the fact that this is something that has been written about in all the major publications at the beginning of the war in Ukraine. It was written by the New York Times, the LA Times. This sort of disparity, this sort of bias that is inherent in this Western gaze that we have in this Western-dominated media environment that we live in. But it is just noted, and then people move on. There's really no follow-up. There is no, solutions proposed. There's no training that's being offered. And this is something also that I think is quite unique to our environment here, is the fact that we're liberal enough and open enough to recognize our faults, but just in a very sort of superficial way, in my opinion. And then we just move on. There's no follow-up. And to me, this is, I think, at the core of this disparity, and also the fact that there's just not many diverse voices out there that you see on mainstream television covering these conflicts. I mean, a newspaper in Kenya or South Africa cannot necessarily afford to send a reporter to Ukraine. And in fact, well, they might have more of a toolbox and more of a relation to their experiences given their history, and I think that we're really missing out in having voices that perhaps have a closer relationship to the stories that they're trying to tell, in my opinion. And I also think that it's important as a journalist to be able to return to places, to just sort of have a long-term commitment with a place where you hopefully learn as you spend time there, and you learn to see to understand a little bit the sensitivities that really tell a fuller story that perhaps can be a little bit more accurate in representing what's happening there, and again, that's just my personal opinion.
Just quickly, I wanted to add that I spent 3 years reporting on Syria, particularly cases of sexualized violence. I was doing a project with Columbia, the public health school, and we were trying to see if we could track the cases sort of methodically. But I was publishing what we were doing, and I was working among, sources, NGOs that were so dedicated to this, are still so dedicated to this. And there was a cadre of journalists so dedicated. Slowly, one by one, and it finally hit me too, they burned the F out. You can't just keep going. And I think that's partly when we say normalizing, I think it's just like, well, what year are we in now? 11 or what, for the Syrian war? We don't talk about it, although there are interesting parallels because the Russians have bombed the crap out of Syria, and they've used some of the same techniques that are going on in Ukraine. And also, just to what Moises said, my story that is coming out this week is very much also about the fact that this is the most covered war in history, Ukraine, that there are more journalists, more investigators. I mean, it's like kind of insane. I talked to one guy, and he said, "You're the 15th journalist I've talked to." Like, I tracked him down in some tiny village because I was told to talk to this guy.
Considering that you're cognizant of this disparity, how do you reconcile what you see in the field, your personal experiences, with the agenda of the news organizations that you work for or work with?
Sure. I think you just need to be persistent, and you need to force to have these conversations with your editors constantly. And I realize that can be a little bit difficult if you're starting out and if you're just trying to sort of establish yourself as a journalist, as a photographer, but I really think that you have a responsibility and a duty to really to you know, to move that narrative forward and to try to sort of, you know, question and challenge these norms that I don't think are really inclusive, and they just don't really change the story much, you know. And so I think you have to be persistent. I think that sometimes you need to compromise as well. If you are part of that system, you need to also understand that you're part of the system, you know, and that you have a role to play there, and that sometimes requires compromise and picking your battles sometimes. But I think that, you know, you do have a responsibility to you know, to raise your voice whenever you think there's something that's unjust, or that you realize that it's not really accurate, and but it's always a conversation. You know, you need to also learn how to work within that system, within that organization, and in a way that's professional, in a way that's respectful, but at the same time where, you know, sort of standing your ground with your beliefs. Yeah.
I mean, from a practical standpoint, I mean, yeah, it's a conversation, as you were saying, you know, between the reporter and the editor, constantly back and forth. What's the story? What are you reporting on? Where are you reporting? How are you reporting? What's your lead? What's your nut graph? What's the background? What's the context? You know, a good editor is worth his or her weight in salt there, you know, and so, you know, that's the best way to ensure that that the agenda, again, I'm not entirely sure what that is, the agenda than my news agency. I mean, yeah, again, we're storytellers, but we're also, I mean, in my case, you know, I'm working in countries that, particularly like Russia, for example, this reversion to the Soviet police state that I referred to earlier. You know, we've had dozens of media organizations have been shut down in Russia over the past, let's say, decade, and certainly even more since the invasion started. The war did not start in February in Ukraine. The war started in 2014. Just note for the record. So, you know, we're reporting on in this authoritarian environment and trying to reach people and get news and information that is not encumbered by Russian government censors or regulators. You know, if that's the agenda, then that's great. And, you know, that's what reporters are supposed to do: get the news out and tell these stories and I'm babbling.
Can I just say something more on this topic? I mean, I think that sometimes it's quite difficult to realize that your work is serving somebody else's agenda, you know, and that you need to sort of find ways to be conscious about that. But you know, I mean, we have plenty of examples of the press being used to further an agenda, for example, in the lead up to the war in Iraq. You know, arguably, there's certain agendas sort of, you know, going on in Ukraine in this war at the moment that are also supported by some of the work that's being published, and you know, and that's what I was saying earlier about being part of the system. You need to be conscious that there's other forces also that are sort of, you know, at hand here, and that you do serve a purpose within that system, and it's something that you need to be, again, conscious of, and hopefully you know, try to fight sometimes as well to make sure that your work is not being used to further something that you might not believe in, or that you're against, especially in context of conflict and war.
Mr. Saman, you've covered events throughout the Middle East, as well as Mr. Yacob, you've been on the ground in Russia and Ukraine. Does your work in an occupation zone differ from your work in a conflict zone? If so, how? And how do you protect your sources and how do you protect yourself in these situations?
I don't go into occupied areas. I just did not. I went to recently liberated areas, but I would like to address the second part of how do you keep your sources safe, because that is critical to what I do. First, I just want to tell a funny story. When we got here and I saw Moises, I said, "You look familiar." And he said, "Oh, yeah." And I said, "Wait, did I know you? Were you a case when I was at CPJ?" And I said, "Were you ever kidnapped?" And he's like, "Well, yeah." And then Nicole over there, I was like, "Well, I was arrested in Congo once." And she's like, "I was arrested too." It's just that's the reality we live with. Kidnapping, danger to us. But the danger to us also brings danger to sources. Your phone can be tracked, so if you're going to meet someone and you're in a relatively sophisticated country, the government you can lead them right to this person who's about to tell a very sensitive story. The other thing is, I find that you have to, this kind of reporting that I do, which is very, like I said, trauma-based, you really have to turn the paradigm of how you conduct an interview as a journalist on its head, in that you really hand it over to the source. You let them lead you. They need their time. You can't re-traumatize people. If you rush too much, you can, and I've heard terrible stories of journalists doing that. How do you protect yourself? In my world, it's more how do I protect myself mentally, although being in Ukraine, body armor, helmet, first aid kit, always. But it's rough. You do lie down and cry sometimes. You do stop sleeping. I find that I have to force myself to eat well in those periods, force myself to sleep, rest, because I've broken down in ways that I can't even tell I'm breaking down until I'm just immobile. Because it is hard to face this stuff over and over. And you do need to process it. And people always ask, well, how can you keep telling these horrible stories? I tell them because I want them to be seen. I hope for change, like we all keep saying. And I know it's interesting that I keep hearing us talk about affecting change, because you wouldn't hear a bunch of political journalists saying this, But what we do is looking at true horrors in the world, and we want them to stop.
When I read the question, I was thinking, occupation zone, and I was thinking in the Ukraine war context, in the Russian occupied parts of Ukraine, there are no independent media outlets. Reporters aren't allowed to run around at all. The reporters that are there, the Russian reporters that are there on the ground are either sanctioned, controlled by the Russian government or the Russian military, or they work for publications that are known for being kind of tub-thumping nationalists. We support the Kremlin, we support the war. But then I got thinking about how reporting in Ukraine, in liberated areas, we're still very much at the Ukrainian military has done an incredible job sort of crafting the narrative and keeping a lid on the bad stories that might reflect poorly on the Ukrainian government. And I think when all the dust finally settles, there'll be some incredible dissertations, reports about how the Ukrainian government has managed to create this public relations campaign. And you've all seen President Zelensky's social media selfie videos that it's just genius what they've done. But the Ukrainian. My point is that the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian government has also controlled the narrative in a really kind of subtle way, not as I think oppressively as what's gone on in Russian-occupied Ukraine, but it's very hard to run around these liberated areas, like in the Kharkiv area, which is recently the site of these successes by the Ukrainian military. You need to get special permission. You need to get military escorts. You need to embed on a daily basis or on a weekly basis to actually go to these points. Before the invasion, when I was out in the trenches, literally in the trenches with these Ukrainian units, we had to get special permission to be there and whatnot, and that's obviously a form of control and limiting what you're able to do as a journalist. But to your point, you have to be mindful of that all the time. I mean, you have to be mindful as a reporter constantly, like, what am I doing? How am I reporting it? What are my limitations? What are the restrictions, and how do I intellectually get around those restrictions? You have to be constantly questioning yourself and constantly questioning how you're doing your reporting, which can be a little maddening at times. You can drive yourself crazy, rewriting your lead over and over and over again. But question everything, question yourself constantly, and that'll serve you well as a reporter.
Yeah, I mean, just to add, I mean, it's a fact in this context where you sort of, as a journalist, in order to get access to the field or to the stories that you want to tell, you do have to sort of choose a side, and I mean, some sites don't really allow you to work with them, so you sort of miss on that story. I mean, a good example is the Taliban, who are now in power in Afghanistan. For close to 15 years, they were these sort of ghosts, that you didn't really have any information, no access to them, and you could only tell the story sort of from the government side or from the American side when the army was there. So this is something, again, that you need to be aware, and I don't know if this maybe requires some sort of announcement before the stories, or next to your story sometimes, because it can be misleading. It can definitely seem that you're just sort of running around on your own, crossing front lines, working with different groups that are part of the conflict, and that's just not the reality, and of course there's a spectrum on how much control over the narrative some groups have, and the effect that has on your sort of ability to produce work in those areas. But certainly you are not just sort of a free agent. You're not able to freely, totally freely, sort of go and report, especially in areas where it might be close to front lines or sensitive areas. And that's just part of the reality of working in this context. I think we should acknowledge that. Yeah.
Thank you to all our speakers for sharing their experiences with us. That brings us to the end of the moderated section of the panel. We'll open it up to questions from the audience in Q&A session, and I would just, if you could raise your hand for this one. Yeah.
I have this really naive, idea that, someday I'll be walking in some street someplace in, Bangkok or Almaty or Seattle or something, and somebody will come up to me and say, "Hey, are you the guy who wrote that incredible story about the mother whose son was killed in this horrible terrorist attack?" Yes, that was me. Thank you so much for telling me that story. It's like, it's what I was saying earlier about being a storyteller and trying to find a way to convey these human experiences to the broadest possible audience around the world in multiple languages as needed. And that drives me forward. Like if I had somebody someday comes up to me and does that, and I get lots of fan mail, I get tons of hate mail, reporters. If you're going to go into this business, you got to be ready for just fire hose of hate mail. But every now and again, you get a nice note from someone saying, "This is really wonderful. Thank you so much for writing this and bringing this to my attention." There, so that keeps me going.
What keeps me going? Well, a few things. One is that I love meeting people and hearing about their lives. It's just fascinating, and talking to experts. I'm not an expert on anything except talking to the other people who can tell me what they do. So I find that just endlessly fascinating. But what really keeps me going doing the specific work I do, I tend to talk to people, to women, and by the way, as a woman reporter, you're not just getting hate mail and death threats, you're getting rape threats, sexism that is like dangerously violent, It's intense. I do well about thinking about all the great death threats. But this work is really important to me because I speak to people who don't often get interviewed or are very unsure whether they want to tell their story. And often I'm the first person they've told it to. So, like, for instance, in Ukraine, there was a woman that my fixer knew, and he wanted to know if I wanted to interview her because he didn't think the other journalists he'd been working with should interview her. I said, okay. And it turned out that she and her husband were fleeing a village northwest of Kyiv when it was occupied. And they had their 3 sons in the car, and 2 of them were shot and killed immediately. The sons, one was 3, one was 15. And the husband was shot, but he's recovered. Anyway, I've never seen someone with such empty eyes. And the husband just sat next to her crying, not talking. It was just intense. But I do it because, just to get, sorry, I thought of something different. But the next week, my fixer came back to me and said, Natalia called me and she wanted to thank you because telling her story to you helped her. And that's why I do what I do. Because I know personally that I tried telling people things when I was a kid that I thought were awful, that I wanted to stop, Nobody would really listen. So I just take it as like, I'm ready to listen. And I think it's an important service.
Thank you, Ms. Wolf. In the interest of time, I'd like to move on to the next question. I'd also like to add, please keep your questions directed at one panelist in under 1 minute. Who do you like to direct this question to?
No, it hasn't come up in my line of work. Ukraine has, been invaded, so no anti-war. Yeah, there are people saying, oh yeah, maybe we should try negotiating with the Russians, that kind of thing. But 90% of the population is they're in the war. It's a country at war. And then in Russia, there's a, as you probably know, there's no, the government has clamped down on civil society to such a degree that there's no ability to engage in public protest or civil disobedience or any sort of anti-war protest. People will stand in the public square and like Perm with a blank piece of paper, and they'll be taken away within 10 minutes by the police just for standing there with a blank piece of paper. Again, the country is reverting to a Soviet police state. where all actions and thoughts of the citizenry is strictly prescribed by the government. So, you know, if you're against the war or if you're against the mobilization effort that's going on, then people are leaving and fleeing to other places. So, you know, it's not really it's not a factor in the reporting that we do.
Well, I think it's just sort of a reminder and reinforces the fact that you as journalists really don't have any sort of protections in these situations, you know. And of course, you know, this particular murder that you mentioned, I mean, it was has its own sort of characteristics, and it seemed to be a targeted, conscious sort of murder, and that might be different than you being caught in a bombing, you know, or in shelling, which is very indiscriminate and random, and or being kidnapped or executed. But I think that basically it just reinforces the fact that there's no rules, you know, and again, there's also a spectrum. There's you as a journalist can be specifically targeted because now more than ever, I think information is power, and you are seen as an actor in you know, with a very important role to play in conflict, you know, as somebody that spreads information. But really, there's no guarantees, and there's no you know, there's no real protections in these situations, unfortunately, and this is something, it's a risk that you have to calculate and measure, but also with the understanding that you can calculate as much as you want, but there's a random factor that there's just no way that you can foresee, and you need to live with that risk if you want to work in these environments.
To add very quickly, I have spoken to many journalists who take off when they're in the heavy bombardment zones and you're wearing your press vest. Those are Velcro, and some journalists I know just take them off because journalists for the last 20 years maybe at least have become specific targets, whereas we are protected as civilians under the Geneva Convention. We're a valuable kind of media target, propaganda target, whatever.
May I add just one last thought about, you know, the murder, the killing of journalists, and to sort of pay a little homage to a colleague of mine named Vera Kiric, who was at her apartment in Kyiv on the evening of April 28th, after the 2 months after the invasion, and she was cooking dinner when a Russian missile struck just outside her apartment building, and her body was found the next day by rescuers. She was a radio producer, planning producer for a Ukrainian service in the Kyiv Bureau. She was a wonderful woman and a marvelous reporter and storyteller. She was killed at home cooking dinner with her cats by a Russian missile. I mean, it's mind-boggling that, you know, it's one thing if you're out in the trenches and somebody kills, and that's tragic beyond words. But I mean, the fact that this woman was just at home and cooking a meal and died in a Russian missile barrage, it's just senseless and infuriating beyond words. There are days that I think, well, I'm doing this work for, you know, in Vera's honor.
I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Ecker. I think, yeah, we can have one more question in the back. was this question for? If,
In terms of activism, yeah, it's like a dirty word to some people, and if you combine it with journalists. I think the majority of people don't understand that this kind of work is different than covering the White House. Say. You know, there are things that are right and wrong. And if you are trying to right a wrong through your work, I don't see that necessarily as activism. It's just you want the world to be better. And yes, we're not ultimate arbiters of what's best, but certainly killing civilians in their apartment buildings, that needs to be stopped somehow. So, yeah, there is a lot of talk within our industry about activism, like activist journalism, and it's not such a dirty word these days within our industry, but I'm cautious about how I talk about it because it can be seen as misinterpreted as like, I prefer President Trump, so I'm going to do everything I can to like twist this and that, you know?
You know, there's this idea in journalism that you go where the facts lead you, where the story leads you there. And, you know, if you set out to tell a story in a certain way, and then there's a contrary piece of evidence or fact or interview that, you know, then you are obligated professionally, ethically, morally to then follow that, even if it undermines your original premise. You know, even if the person you're documenting who is, I don't know what, an alleged rapist or something, then is clear to, you know, you go where the facts lead you. And so, you know, being an activist journalist, that sort of defies that whole notion that, you know, you're leading specifically to a certain and prescribed endpoint there. So I can think of countless times where I set out, well, here's the story, and this is how I pitched it, and then in the course of reporting it, story turns into a different thing altogether, and that's maddening beyond words, because it'd be easier if it all just fit nicely into this preconceived notion that I had. But, you know, that's a good journalist needs to be able to adjust and move where the facts take him or her.
Yeah, I personally, I think it's a very gray area and a blurry line that it's hard to really discern sometimes. I mean, certainly, you know, your work can be co-opted by people trying to push different narratives, and you know, you can be accused of you know, pushing a certain perspective or a certain narrative. And does that make you an activist? I mean, you know, you know, one thing I can tell you is you know, in a lot of these contexts that I have worked with, you know, the people that work alongside you, that facilitate the work that you do, and that you sometimes put your life in their hands because they're the local sort of sources that show you around and take you around, they are activists, you know, and themselves taking risks doing what they do. So I think this relationship, you know, it's blurry, and I think as such, you know, you need to be sort of careful, you know, trying to really make absolute sort of statements and try to really, you know, pretend to tell a complete or you know, accurate story. I think that there's so many variables, like, again, you know, working on one side versus another side. You know, when people that have certain connections to big players in a particular story are the ones showing you around, giving you access, I mean, that certainly, it's a, you know, blurred sort of a relationship that you have. And I think as long as you're open about that and forward about that, I think that's, you know, that's the best you can do. But it certainly, there's no clear, you know, I think it's a very gray area, especially now too. I mean, conflicts are more and more, they're, you know, with particular actors that are not necessarily part of the state, you know, more sort of militant groups that control territory and a lot of times you find yourself, if you want to tell a story from these areas, you need to sort of attach yourself to people that really have close links to those people. So again, I think it's a gray area that
Can I
we
just add one
operate in. Yeah.
Oh, it's one sentence. In terms of activist journalism, when I was talking about there's a right and a wrong, I was also looking for signs of Ukrainians having perpetrated war crimes. It's just wherever it falls, wherever it goes.
We're at time, so I'd like to thank our speakers again for such an insightful conversation. Our next event, Women in Journalism Around the World, will take place here shortly. And refreshments are outside. Thank you once again to everyone for coming, and have a good afternoon.